So does nobody have anything they want to know today?
The answers.
The answers, that's good. I like it. The answers. What do you not know that you think might be important? I suppose we don't actually know what the answers are, do we? Well, hopefully I'll be able to give you some of them.
I suppose how to structure it, you know, how to sort of put.
Yeah.
You've done your research, but you're not quite sure what to do with it, where to put the words and subheadings, all that kind of thing.
And kind of how long it should be too.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. What else? What do you guys already know about the discussion? It's a bit enigmatic, isn't it? The discussion.
I think it says, I've just read, what I read in the handbook, and you're looking at the analysis and linking it in with your aims and objectives.
Aha. That's pretty important because it's a reminder that you need to actually keep your aims and objectives or your research questions in mind while you're writing, right? Which, as obvious as that sounds, we do forget while we're actually doing it, don't we? And it's easy to go off on a tangent.
Yeah, because you're saying about going back to your conceptual framework and things like that.
Yeah, so go back to the theory.
I don't know the two things.
I don't
I don't know if we
Which
all got the same
programs are
one.
you guys in? Which program are you all in? I mean, you're all in different ones, I
I'm
assume.
an HR management master's.
Great, yeah. And yourself?
I'm the executive MBA.
Great. And you are in
Wildlife biology.
wildlife biology, nice.
Yeah, I think mine is different.
And you are Andrew, right? Oh, yeah. All right. I knew it was in there somewhere. I'm sorry, I forgot what you were working on exactly. Right, computing, of course. All right, so is there anything else we want to know today besides structure and how long it needs to be? No question is a bad question.
Good start.
That's a very good one, in fact. Where to start? What else?
Is this focusing more on the
Research that we've done ourselves, isn't it, rather than the whole dissertation?
Um,
Or are you including bits on methodology and everything like that?
well, this is specifically just about the discussion,
Yeah.
which of course relates to all the other pieces, but we were just going to focus on this one bit. But if you guys have questions about the other bits, let's just bring them out anyway. We might as well. We've got 2 hours. There's not very many of us. So I'm sure we've got time to work those things through as well. So while we're going through this, feel free to just pipe up and ask whatever questions you've got to ask. We'll do a few activities today to get you kind of thinking about how this thing works. And I'll talk to you a little bit about it. But this is primarily about formulating your discussion. If you're not quite at this stage yet, don't worry. I sort of expect that nobody is. Am I right? Yeah. Has anybody finished all their research and got a draft and ready to go? Yeah? No? Okay, good. That's good. So I brought some examples for us to work with as well so that we can get some practice without you having to worry about having had all that stuff done.
Excuse me, will you be able to give us a copy of the slides? Or?
Yes, I will.
Yeah.
And I apologize, it's a bit difficult to see, but yeah, I'll circulate these around to you afterwards. All right, so today we'll talk about the master's dissertation just a bit generally and what the features of a well-crafted dissertation are. Critical and analytical thinking we'll talk about for a little bit, which is directly related to the discussion and what the discussion is all about. We'll talk about the other sections just very briefly. And I will turn off this unfortunate message. There we go. And then we'll talk about the discussion specifically for a little while. So what its purpose is, how you structure it, and we'll talk about some top tips and further support for you guys. So a master's dissertation, as you probably already know, it argues in defense of a particular thesis. So this is a major work. This is probably the biggest thing that you've ever done, am I right? Yeah, so this is where you pull together all kinds of research and your own analytical skills and your critical skills to defend a particular thesis or to answer a particular research question. It should contain original and substantial information, substantial amounts of research, original ideas, not, earth-shattering ideas necessarily, but it should be your own, right? You're looking for gaps in the research to answer a question that hopefully would be interesting to a reader. It demonstrates critical and analytical thinking, and this is key for the discussion. The discussion is really where you do that, so we'll focus on that today. And it's supported with citations and references to published academic literature, right? So I want you to just take a minute, and you've got some sticky notes sitting on the desk there, and write down what you think might be the #1 feature of a good discussion. Well, what have we got? Good discussion. So a good discussion has critical analysis. Absolutely, and that's what we're going to talk about next here. It's a transition of print and digital. Oh, that's interesting. Bringing in research, I guess, because a lot of the research you're doing is online, isn't it? Right? So it's bringing that into your written work. Evidence of an argument, absolutely. Subject, yes, it should. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about today too, is that your discussion should tell a story. Should be about something as opposed to simply a list of facts. Arguments and counter-arguments backed up with factual information, absolutely. So we're kind of all on the same track here, aren't we? Critical thinking is going to be the key to tying all of those things together. So you've probably spent some time already thinking about critical thinking and analysis and what that means, am I right? Yeah? No? It's all quite vague, is it? Have you ever had that feedback, like that your writing isn't critical enough, that it's too descriptive? Yeah. That's really frustrating feedback, because it's like, yeah, that's great, but what do I do with that, right? So I want you to take a couple of minutes in groups, and since we've only got 5, we can go in a 2 and a 3. How about that? And brainstorm for just a few minutes here about what critical and analytical thinking means. Okay? Critical and analytical thinking, what does that mean? And I'll give you guys 5.
Understanding the subject and being able to agree or argue against it. Trying to find a blind point in the argument and then showing your own original opinion or your own thoughts on it.
Right.
Looking at different viewpoints and reading as much literature as possible, reading broadly so that you have a wide range of theories and ideas.
Oh gosh, how do I put that into one word? I'm just going to write scope, meaning a wide range of theories and ideas, yeah. Looking for the gaps in the literature to bring your own original research to things, yeah, absolutely. And looking at counter arguments. And this is very important. You want to be able to consider other viewpoints as well as your own. And that shows that you've considered your question from every angle. That's a very tricky thing to do in writing, right? Because it's hard not to feel like you're undermining your argument when you start presenting the counter arguments. But there are ways of addressing that, so hopefully we can talk about that in a little bit. Did you have any ideas over here about critical and analytical thinking?
No, we were talking about it. Really fun.
Having trouble putting it to words?
Yeah, and like the same thing, I've had feedback where it's too general, and like being in a science, you should have like concrete, not kind of. Anyway, it's too bad.
That's very important, actually, that your points need to be both concrete and specific, because it's very difficult to engage critically with a vague idea, right? Yeah, and it's hard to demonstrate your own critical skills, which you've all got. You've all got critical skills, or you wouldn't have made it this far, right? It's hard to demonstrate that when you're struggling with finding the specific language for talking about your thought process, isn't it? So We'll talk about that a little bit more, but specificity is key in your writing. And sometimes we're a bit vague, right, because we don't really know quite yet what we want to say. We're having a hard time getting there, and that's all right. Sometimes you need to write through these sort of vague notions to boil them down to the specific. So that's all part of the process. Critical thinking is a process. It's a skill that you learn and a skill that you practice and that you become better at. It's not something you're just born with. So if you feel like, oh, I'm just not very good at this, you can put that thought aside, because it's not about being good at it or not good at it. It's about learning how to practice this skill, and there's very specific ways of practicing this skill and developing it. And you'll be developing this throughout your education, well beyond even this dissertation. So give yourselves a break. But this process involves 3 steps usually. Analysis, where you break things down. So you've got a set of facts and you're analyzing them, trying to make sense of them, right? Synthesis, where you bring all the different parts together in a coherent way. So this is what happens when you're, researching the literature, for instance, right? You read about 10 articles or 20 articles on the same topic that are all saying different things, and you analyze, well, what are these arguments about? What are their strengths? What are their flaws? The synthesis part is where you start to bring them together to tell a story, as I was talking about, right? You're looking for a thread that can bring all these things together. And then you evaluate. So once you've synthesized everything and brought it together, you start to make judgments. Based on the evidence that's in front of you, you start to form your own informed opinion. And this is key to the dissertation discussion. It's very easy to slide sort of back into this mode of just reiterating the facts. Well, so-and-so said this, and my research found that, and then so-and-so said that, and then that, and then that, and then that. There's not much opinion in writing of that style, right? So you want to foreground your own opinion, what you actually think about what came out of that. Is there anything that you think might hold you back from writing and thinking in this way? Is there anything that goes on in your own heads that stops you from maybe going that extra step into having your own opinion about the material? Yeah?
Yeah.
What's
Because the sources that you're looking at are very concrete, or they've been studying this for such a long time. So to question anything that they've kind of said by reading 20 articles doesn't make you feel confident enough to comment.
Yeah. And that is the most common thing that I hear amongst students at all levels, and professors even, right? You feel like, well, these guys are the experts. How could I possibly question them? They know more than I do. That doesn't mean that you don't have a right to your own opinion. It doesn't mean that you don't have the skill to evaluate those things. Nobody's perfect. No methodology is perfect. No study is perfect. No answer is complete. So you absolutely do have the skill and the right to step in with your own opinion. Anything else that might hold you back from this critical process, you think? Besides that feeling of insecurity?
Sometimes it's just quicker to, it takes time to be critical, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You want to, you've read all the stuff and you want to sort of explain all the knowledge that you've learned. But I find myself just dumping all that knowledge onto a bit of paper and maybe not taking the time to question it so much. But that, like you say, it's just practicing and making sure you do it. But
yeah, absolutely. Time, oh my goodness, is it ever time consuming, right? And it would be a lot easier if we could just dump all the things we've collected onto a page and then move on. That is where you start getting that feedback of, well, this isn't analytical enough, this is too descriptive, I need more critical thinking. So it's that extra step, but boy, does it take time. You need to really mull things over in your head for a while, don't you, to figure out, what you actually think about these things, how to evaluate the research you're doing. A critical analysis will have these features. Usually it will compare and contrast authors' views. So rather than simply saying, well, this is what this article is about, it might take 3 or 4 articles and say, well, these 3 or 4 articles say these 2 things. One is for this, the other is against it. these might be the reasons why they're coming up with different results. Does that make sense? So we'll bring them together into a compare and contrast mode so you can start to evaluate why people come up with different results. And that ties into the next point, which is it will evaluate the effectiveness of the methodology. So depending on your discipline, I mean, in the sciences, you'll do this probably more in the social sciences than you might do it in business, but you will do it in every discipline. It's just question the method behind all of the other research that you're reading. And that's very important, especially when you're doing your own primary research. You need to consider what the shortcomings of other methodologies might be to decide what you think might be a better one for your own research, and that's part of finding the gaps, yeah. It'll note areas in which authors disagree. This is often a great way to place yourself in the context of the literature, to discover your own original research, to think about what a problem might be in the current research. If you're working on a question that you discover everybody has already agreed on, it's probably not really a question worth asking, right? So you want to start looking at where there are disagreements and where there are problems that might still need to be resolved, that you can step in and try to resolve. It will relate your topic to previous studies. So of course this ties into everything I've been saying, right? You always want to be thinking in your own work about how you sit within the context of the literature in your field. You always want to think of yourself, if you can combat this insecurity that we've all got, the imposter syndrome, right? You want to think of yourself as a scholar within this community of scholars that you're reading around, right? So I just want to move on to get to the meat and bones of this, right? The discussion. The discussion is where you are demonstrating most of your analysis and your synthesis and your critical thinking. The rest of your dissertation you will as well. And it should follow probably this general structure. You'll have your front matter, right? Your abstract, your table of contents, your introduction, a literature review, your methodology, results and findings, discussion, a conclusion, and then your reference list and appendices. Does anyone here have a different format that they're meant to follow besides this sort of general format? No? Looks about right? Well, that makes our job easier today, doesn't it?
I think on the way it's listed,
Yeah.
it's not. They don't use the word discussion; they use analysis. But it's
Yeah.
the same, I guess.
Yeah, that
And
would
the
be
discussion is analysing all your results, isn't it?
exactly.
So I've never used.
Yeah.
In our course, they don't use the word discussion.
That's interesting. So
Yeah.
these analysis, and actually analysis will be very much more helpful, isn't it? Because it tells you what you need to
Well,
do. A discussion can be all kinds of things, right? But an analysis is quite clear. What would you say is the difference between like the results or findings section and the discussion section?
The results.
Mhm.
You would just list,
Mhm.
or more in the science field, we would just list our findings. We
Yeah.
wouldn't really question anything. We would just, if we had maps, we'd just, or charts or graphs or something, we'd explain what we see in it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In that chapter right before the discussion, the results or the findings, whatever it happens to be called in your discipline, this is where you simply list what you found in your research. This is your results. You might, as you said, put it into a chart to explain it, but you don't go into the analysis of it. You simply present it. So that chapter would read a bit more like a list of facts, yeah? Whereas what would the discussion look like by comparison, do you think?
During the discussion with my coursemate, some of them to put their primary research results into discussion part and to demonstrate their opinion, some response from their questionnaire or something.
Right, yeah. So this is where you demonstrate your opinion and start to analyze or respond to the answers that you found in your findings, yeah. So this is where you kind of pull out the important details and talk about what they actually mean as opposed to what they were. Does that make sense? So you've got this difference between just showing the data and then talking about what that actually means. So let's let's think about the introduction and discussion. So these are the bookends of your dissertation. This might be a helpful way of thinking about it. I don't know about you guys, but whenever I do research, if I pick up an article, I usually read the introduction and the discussion. And if I need more, I might go into more details, but I always go to those two sections because those two sections are going to tell me what this is about, what the main argument is, or the research question and the thesis, right? And then also what the main findings were. So the discussion is where you get the point, basically, yeah? So as you're writing your own, you want to think about the introduction and discussion that way as the two bookends, and all of the data just goes in the middle, yeah, and the literature as well. You can also think of it in the shape of an hourglass. And we'll talk more specifically about structure, but I want to just put this metaphor out to you to get you thinking about it. An introduction will start generally, right? You'll start with a big research question, and then you'll talk about the context, and then you'll boil that down into your own hypothesis and then your own research question. So you start with the general and you move down to the specific in your introduction, right? And then you've got this little bit in the middle. Well, actually, it's a very big bit, isn't it? With all the specifics of your research. So this is your methodology, your questions, and then your findings. So this is where all the data comes. And it gets filtered through that methodology and comes into the discussion where you move in the opposite direction from that very specific data into the general, right? So you've got your research, the answers, hopefully, to your research questions. And you draw out the implications of that. So in a way, you kind of come back around to the research context, right? To talk about how your findings fit into the larger question, how they fit into your field, what the implications of it are for research in your field. Does that make sense? So you've got this kind of filtering process going on. But when you're writing the discussion, and again, as I said, we'll get into the structure more specifically, but think for now about going from the specific into the more general, drawing it out. So when you're writing that discussion, where to start? Well, a good place to start is actually to go back to your introduction and remind yourself, what was I trying to do here? What was my question? What was the context of my research? What was I trying to accomplish? And kind of tracing that backwards again with that new information that you've drawn out from your findings. Does that make sense? Yeah? So the discussion is your opportunity to explain your results and to interpret them. And this is actually, in a weird way, kind of exciting, right? Hopefully you've come up with some interesting stuff in your research, and this is your chance to say, like, oh my goodness, look at what I found. This is great. This is going to change everything, right? Or so we hope. But it is going to be exciting, hopefully. This is where you get to answer your research questions. You finally get to say, okay, I found out what it is that I set out to find out. Presumably you set out to discover the answers to these questions because you had an interest in them. So when you get bogged down in the work, don't forget that part, right? This is fun. This is also where you get to justify your approach. And we were talking a little bit before there about the gaps in the literature, right? Maybe you used a different kind of methodology to answer your research question than other people do. And maybe that turned up some really good stuff. And this is your chance to say, well, I tried this new method of questionnaire and it worked really well because this is what I found. And that's great. You get to kind of show off a little bit there. You get to critically evaluate your project. So on top of showing off all the things that you did brilliantly, you get to also evaluate whether or not there were flaws in your methodology. And there are flaws in every methodology. And it's very important to recognize that. So on top of being critical in the traditional sense, you want to be critical also in the self-reflexive sense. And any discussion, and especially conclusions. We won't talk about conclusions so much today, but a good conclusion is always very self-reflexive. Not self-effacing. You don't want to write down like, oh, I did this all wrong. But you do want to take a moment to say, you know what I could have done that would have been really interesting. And that's also interesting, hopefully, for you to think about where you could go from here. And then you get to ensure that your research is critically sound. So you get to step back and now, instead of evaluating everybody else's work, you get to evaluate your own, which is a great learning experience. Ultimately, oops, all right, jumped ahead. This is your opportunity to have an opinion, which is not something we feel like we get to have a lot of in our studies, am I right? So I want to take a few minutes here, and we talked about critical thinking, what critical thinking is. The translation from critical thinking to critical writing is where most of us falter, am I right? How do I actually do this in practice? With that feedback in mind that you've probably all seen on a paper, you need to be more critical. I want you to take another 5 minutes here in your groups to think about or brainstorm the difference between, or the differences between critical writing and descriptive writing. So what might descriptive writing look like, and what might critical writing look like? Okay?